Sarah Chen had seen entire star systems burn. She had led boarding parties through the twisted corridors of enemy dreadnoughts, fought hand-to-hand with Krillian shock troopers in zero gravity, and once held a defensive position for 18 hours straight while her squad evacuated civilians from a collapsing space station. At 34, she was the youngest human to ever receive the Galactic Cross of Valor, and her tactical brilliance had saved millions of lives across 3 different sectors. But, standing in the parking lot of Jefferson High School on a crisp October morning, watching teenagers stream past her with their backpacks and smartphones, Sarah felt more nervous than she had before any battle. "You sure about this, Commander?" asked Marcus Webb, her former communications officer, who had insisted on driving her to her first day. The burly man with cybernetic implants running along his jaw looked deeply uncomfortable in civilian clothes. "I mean, teaching? You could have any position you wanted in the fleet. Hell, they offered you admiral stripes." Sarah adjusted the strap of her simple canvas bag, a stark contrast to the tactical gear she had worn for the past 16 years. "I'm sure, Marcus. The war's over. The hegemony is scattered. It's time to do something that actually builds instead of destroys." The war against the Hegemony Coalition had lasted 12 years and had touched every corner of known space. Humanity, despite being one of the youngest species to achieve interstellar travel, had quickly become the backbone of the resistance. Human adaptability, creativity, and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness had turned the tide against an enemy that had conquered dozens of older, more technologically advanced civilizations. Sarah had been 22 when the first hegemony fleets had appeared at the edge of human space. She had enlisted the next day, leaving behind her graduate studies in xenobiology. The girl who had once dreamed of discovering new forms of life among the stars instead learned how to end life with ruthless efficiency. Now, walking up the steps to Jefferson High, she was trying to remember what it felt like to be that young woman with dreams instead of nightmares. Principal Martinez was waiting for her in the main office, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who had somehow maintained an optimistic outlook despite 30 years in education. "Miss Chen, welcome to Jefferson High. I have to say, when we received your application, we were surprised." "I imagine so." Sarah kept her voice level, professional. She had learned long ago to speak softly when her reputation preceded her. "I know my background is unconventional for a teacher." "Unconventional is one word for it." Martinez smiled warmly. "The Sarah Chen wants to teach high school biology. The woman who held the outer rim against impossible odds. The woman who saved the Centauri colonies. My daughter has your poster on her bedroom wall." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. The hero worship was the hardest part of coming home. "I'm just someone who did her job, Principal Martinez. And now I want a different job. Well, I won't pretend I understand your motivations, but I'm grateful to have you. Your credentials in xenobiology are impeccable, even if most of them are classified. And, frankly, we could use someone who knows how to handle difficult situations." As if summoned by those words, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Raised voices, the sound of something hitting a locker, and then, a girl's voice cutting through the chaos. "Get your hands off me, you mouth-breathing troglodyte." Martinez sighed. "That would be Elena Vasquez. Brilliant girl, but she has issues with authority. And with other students. And with pretty much everyone." Through the office window, Sarah could see a small crowd had gathered around 2 students. A tall, broad-shouldered boy in a Letterman jacket had a smaller girl pressed against a bank of lockers. The girl was maybe 16, with dark hair and fierce eyes that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of her own reflection in the mirror after particularly brutal battles. "The boy is Derek Morrison," Martinez continued. "Star quarterback, full scholarship to State University already lined up. His father is on the school board. The girl is Elena. Straight A's in everything, but she's been suspended twice this semester for fighting. Most teachers have given up on her." Sarah watched as Elena drove her elbow into Derek's ribs and broke free from his grip. Even from this distance, Sarah could see the calculating way the girl moved, the way she immediately positioned herself to keep the wall at her back and multiple escape routes open. Those were survival instincts, learned through experience. "What's her story?" Sarah asked. Elena's parents died in a transport accident 3 years ago. She lives with her grandmother now, works nights at a diner to help with expenses. The other kids, well, they're not always kind to someone who doesn't fit in. Sarah was already moving toward the door. I'll handle this. Miss Chen, wait. You haven't even been introduced to the students yet. Maybe we should call security. But Sarah was already in the hallway, moving through the crowd of students with the same quiet authority that had once parted crowds of panicked civilians during evacuations. The teenagers instinctively stepped aside, sensing something in her bearing that demanded respect. Elena was backing away from Derek and his two friends, her hands clenched into fists. She was outnumbered and knew it, but there was no fear in her stance, only cold calculation. Sarah recognized that look. She had worn it herself many times. "Gentlemen," Sarah said quietly, and somehow her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "I think it's time you moved along to class." Derek turned toward her, his face flushed with adolescent arrogance. "Who the hell are you supposed to be? This isn't your business, lady." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. She had learned that silence could be more intimidating than any threat. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm your new biology teacher. And, you're right, this isn't my business. It's also not yours. The young lady asked you to leave her alone. So I'm going to ask you once, very politely, to respect her wishes and go to class." One of Derek's friends whispered something that made Derek's eyes widen slightly. Sarah saw recognition dawn on his face. Good. Let him process exactly who he was dealing with. "You're her," Derek said, his bravado deflating slightly. "You're the war hero. The one who fought the aliens." "I'm a high school biology teacher," Sarah corrected. "And you're a student who needs to get to class before he's late." Derek looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's eyes convinced him otherwise. He jerked his head at his friends, and they moved off down the hall, but not before Derek shot a poisonous look at Elena. "This isn't over, freak," he muttered as he passed. Sarah turned to Elena, who was watching her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Up close, Sarah could see that the girl was painfully thin, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many late nights and not enough food. Her clothes were clean but worn, carefully maintained hand-me-downs. "You didn't have to do that," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. "I can handle idiots like Derek Morrison." "I'm sure you can," Sarah replied. "But you shouldn't have to." "Not here." Elena snorted. "Right. Because high school is supposed to be some kind of safe space. You obviously don't remember being 16. Actually, I skipped most of high school. Graduated early, went straight to university." Sarah fell into step beside Elena as the crowd dispersed and they began walking toward the biology wing. "Spent most of my teenage years with my nose in textbooks, studying everything I could about xenobiology. I was going to change the world through science. What happened?" Despite herself, Elena sounded curious. "The war happened. Turns out the galaxy wasn't quite ready for peaceful scientific exchange." They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments. Sarah noticed that other students gave Elena a wide berth, and she could hear whispered comments as they passed. "There goes crazy Elena. I heard she tried to stab someone with a scalpel in chemistry class. My mom says her grandmother is a witch or something." Elena's jaw tightened with each comment, but she kept walking, her head held high. Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest. She had seen this before, on dozens of worlds. The strong preying on the weak, using fear and intimidation to maintain their position in the hierarchy. It was the same impulse that had driven the hegemony to try to conquer the galaxy. "Elena," Sarah said quietly. "Can I ask you something?" The girl shrugged. "It's a free country. For now. Why do you want to learn? I saw your transcripts. You have perfect grades in every science class, near perfect in everything else. You work nights, you're dealing with difficult social situations. It would be easier to just coast. Why put in the effort?" Elena stopped walking and turned to face her. For a moment, Sarah saw past the defensive armor the girl wore and glimpsed something raw and vulnerable underneath. Because it's the only thing that makes sense, Elena said fiercely. Everything else is just chaos. People being cruel because they can. Random accidents that take away everything you care about. Politics and popularity contests and all that meaningless garbage. But science has rules. It has truth. It doesn't care if you're popular or rich or if your parents are dead. It just is. Sarah nodded slowly. She understood that hunger for truth, for something solid to hold on to when everything else was uncertain. That's a good reason. But, you know what I learned during the war? What? Science without compassion is just another weapon. And, compassion without strength is just good intentions. You need both if you want to actually change anything. They had reached Sarah's classroom, a standard high school biology lab with blacktop tables, outdated microscopes, and faded posters of cellular structures on the walls. Sarah looked around with mixed feelings. After commanding a starship with holographic displays and quantum computers, this felt almost primitive. But there was something honest about it, something real. This is me, Sarah said. Elena, if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open. And, I mean always. Even if it's just about science. Elena studied her for a long moment. Why? You don't even know me. For all you know, all those rumors are true. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I am dangerous. Sarah smiled, and, for the first time since coming home, it felt genuine. Because I've met dangerous people, Elena. Real monsters. And, you're not one of them. You're just angry at a world that hasn't been fair to you. And, you know what? You have every right to be angry. But, don't let that anger consume you. Use it. Channel it into something productive. Like what? Like showing all these people exactly what they're underestimating when they dismiss you. Elena almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, she just nodded and walked away, but Sarah noticed that her shoulders were a little straighter, her step a little lighter. The rest of Sarah's first day passed in a blur of introductions, lesson plans, and the controlled chaos that was high school education. She met her other classes, assessed the curriculum, and tried to remember what it was like to think about mitosis and protein synthesis instead of tactical orbital strikes and enemy fleet movements. Her last class of the day was advanced placement biology, supposedly the brightest students in the school. Sarah looked out at 30 faces, most of them bored or distracted, a few showing genuine interest. Elena sat in the back corner, as far from the other students as possible, but her attention was laser-focused on Sarah. Good afternoon, Sarah began. I'm Sarah Chen, and I'll be your biology teacher for the rest of the semester. I know most of you were expecting Mrs. Patterson to return from her sabbatical, but she's decided to extend her leave. So you're stuck with me. A hand shot up near the front. A girl with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than Elena made in a month. Miss Chen, is it true that you killed like 1,000 aliens in the war? Sarah sighed internally. First, they weren't aliens to themselves, they were people. Different from us, but still people. Second, war isn't a video game, Jessica. It's not about kill counts or high scores. It's about protecting what you care about and hoping you can live with the choices you make. Another hand. A boy this time, all earnest enthusiasm. But you did fight them, right? The hegemony? What were they like? Sarah looked out at their eager faces and made a decision. She had planned to keep her past separate from her teaching, to focus purely on biology. But these kids needed to understand something important. The Hegemony Coalition wasn't a single species, she said. It was made up of dozens of different worlds, different peoples. They weren't evil, not really. They were afraid. Their leaders convinced them that the only way to survive in a hostile galaxy was to conquer it. That the only way to be safe was to make sure everyone else was afraid of them. She walked to the whiteboard and drew a simple diagram, a large circle surrounded by many smaller ones. They started small. A few systems. But fear is like a virus. It spreads. Every conquest made them stronger, but it also made them more afraid, because now they had more to lose. So they conquered more worlds, enslaved more peoples, until they controlled a third of the known galaxy. So what stopped them? Elena asked from the back of the room, speaking for the first time. Sarah turned to look at her. Science stopped them. Specifically, humans stopped them. And, you know why? Not because we were stronger or smarter or more advanced. We weren't. Most of the species in the coalition had centuries of technological development on us. She drew a small circle at the edge of the diagram, separate from all the others. We stopped them because we refused to be afraid. Not because we were brave, but because we were too stubborn to know when to give up. And because we understood something the hegemony never learned. What? Jessica asked, despite herself drawn into the story. That diversity is strength. The hegemony conquered through conformity. Everyone had to think the same, act the same, be the same. But, humans, we're messy. We disagree with each other. We come from different backgrounds, different cultures, different ways of thinking. And, when you put all that chaos together, you get something the hegemony never expected. Sarah drew lines connecting the human circle to several of the others in the coalition. Innovation. Adaptation. The ability to see problems from angles no one else had considered. We didn't beat the hegemony with superior firepower. We beat them by convincing their own member worlds that there was another way to live. That they didn't have to be afraid anymore. The classroom was silent. Even the students who had been checking their phones were paying attention now. But, what does this have to do with biology? Asked a boy Sarah didn't recognize. Sarah smiled. Everything. Biology is about diversity. About different species finding different ways to survive, to adapt, to thrive. About ecosystems where every organism, from the smallest bacteria to the largest predator, plays a role in keeping the whole system healthy. And about what happens when one species decides it's more important than all the others. She gestured toward the diagram on the board. The hegemony tried to turn the galaxy into a monoculture. One way of thinking, one way of living, one definition of what it meant to be civilized. And it nearly worked, because monocultures can be very efficient in the short term. But they're also fragile. When conditions change, when new challenges arise, they can't adapt. They collapse. Elena raised her hand. So what you're saying is that being different isn't a weakness. It's a survival advantage. Exactly. In biology, we call it genetic diversity. In society, we call it progress. The species that survive are the ones that can adapt to change, and you can't adapt if everyone is exactly the same. Sarah looked around the classroom, making eye contact with each student. Every single one of you brings something different to this ecosystem we call a school. Different backgrounds, different perspectives, different ways of thinking about problems. That's not something to suppress or be ashamed of. It's something to celebrate. The bell rang, ending the class. As students gathered their things and headed for the door, Sarah called out, "For tomorrow, I want you to think about an organism that demonstrates an unusual adaptation strategy. Be prepared to explain how that adaptation helps the organism survive in its environment." Elena was the last to leave. She paused at the door and turned back. "Ms. Chen? That story about the war, was it true? About humans being too stubborn to give up?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. The truth about war is always more complicated than the stories we tell about it afterward. But, yes, that part is true. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to give up, even when everyone tells you the situation is hopeless. Elena nodded thoughtfully and left. Sarah watched her go, wondering if she had gotten through to the girl or if she was just another adult trying to impose her worldview on someone who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. After the last student had left, Sarah sat alone in her classroom, looking out at the rows of empty desks. She thought about her former life, about the command deck of the Starship Defiance, about the weight of making decisions that would determine whether entire star systems lived or died. This was different. Quieter. But, in some ways, it felt more important. Those 30 students would go out into the world and become teachers, doctors, engineers, leaders. The ideas she planted here might grow and spread in ways she would never know about. Her communicator buzzed. A message from Marcus. "How was the first day, Commander? Ready to come back to the real world yet?" Sarah looked around her classroom again, at the periodic table on the wall, at the microscopes waiting to reveal hidden worlds, at the homework assignment she still needed to prepare. Then, she typed back, "This is the real world, Marcus." Everything else was just the prelude. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something on Elena's desk. A small piece of paper, folded carefully. She picked it up and unfolded it. Written in precise handwriting were the words, "Thank you for seeing me instead of just my reputation." Sarah smiled and slipped the note into her bag. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. For the first time since coming home from the war, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Outside, the sun was setting behind the football stadium where Derek Morrison and his teammates were practicing. Sarah could hear Coach Williams shouting instructions, the sound of bodies colliding, the sharp blast of his whistle. It was a different kind of battle, but still a battle nonetheless. Sarah walked to her car, already thinking about tomorrow's lesson plan. She wanted to teach them about symbiosis, about how different species could work together for mutual benefit instead of seeing each other as threats to be eliminated. It was, she reflected, perhaps the most important lesson she had ever taught. 3 weeks into Sarah's teaching career at Jefferson High, the first real crisis hit like a plasma torpedo to the hull of an unshielded transport. It started with Elena, as Sarah had somehow known it would. The girl had been coming to Sarah's classroom during lunch periods, ostensibly to work on extra credit assignments but really just to have a place where she could eat in peace. They would discuss everything from protein folding to xenobiology to the social dynamics of ant colonies, conversations that reminded Sarah why she had fallen in love with science in the first place. Elena was brilliant in a way that went beyond mere intelligence. She saw patterns, connections, implications that escaped most graduate students. When Sarah had introduced the concept of convergent evolution, Elena had immediately grasped not just the biological principle but its broader implications for understanding intelligence across species. "So you're saying," Elena had mused over a sandwich that consisted mainly of peanut butter and hope, "that intelligence itself might be a convergent trait? That any species that survives long enough will eventually develop abstract reasoning, regardless of their physical form or evolutionary history?" That's one theory, Sarah had agreed. And it's one that proved crucial during the war. Understanding that the hegemony species thought differently than us, but not incorrectly, allowed us to predict their strategies and eventually communicate with them. But if intelligence is convergent, then stupidity might be too, Elena had added with a bitter smile. Which would explain a lot about this place. That conversation had happened on a Tuesday. By Friday, Elena was in the principal's office facing suspension, and Sarah was learning that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with plasma cannons and shield generators, but with words and policies and the entrenched power structures of small-town politics. The incident had started in Derek Morrison's advanced chemistry class. Derek had been struggling with the coursework since the beginning of the semester, but his father's position on the school board and his status as the star quarterback had insulated him from consequences. When Mr. Rodriguez had announced a major lab practical that would count for 30% of the semester grade, Derek had approached Elena after class. "Look, freak," he had said, apparently having learned nothing from his previous encounter with Sarah. "I need you to be my lab partner for this practical. And, by lab partner, I mean you do all the work and I get half the credit." "I'd rather dissect my own liver," Elena had replied, not looking up from her textbook. "That wasn't a request," Derek had said, his voice taking on an uglier tone. "You know what happened to the last girl who didn't cooperate with me? Ask around. People have accidents in chemistry lab all the time." That was when Elena had stood up, looked Derek directly in the eye, and delivered what witnesses later described as a lecture on human anatomy that was both scientifically accurate and creatively threatening. The exact words varied depending on who was telling the story, but the general consensus was that Elena had described in precise detail what would happen to Derek's reproductive capabilities if he continued to threaten her. Mr. Rodriguez, unfortunately, had walked in just as Elena was explaining the molecular structure of capsaicin and its effects on mucous membranes. Within an hour, Elena was sitting in Principal Martinez's office with her grandmother, a tiny woman named Rosa Vasquez who spoke limited English but radiated the kind of quiet dignity that Sarah recognized from the war refugees she had helped evacuate from contested systems. Derek, meanwhile, was in the nurse's office claiming to be traumatized by Elena's violent threats. Sarah had heard about the incident from Marcus, who had been substituting for the absent PE teacher and had overheard the story in the faculty lounge. She arrived at the principal's office just as Martinez was explaining the school's zero-tolerance policy on threats and violent language. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vasquez, but Elena's behavior has escalated beyond what we can tolerate. This is her third incident this semester, and threatening another student with bodily harm crosses a line we simply cannot ignore." Through the glass partition, Sarah could see Elena sitting ramrod straight in a chair, her face a mask of controlled fury. Her grandmother sat beside her, holding Elena's hand and speaking quietly in rapid Spanish. Sarah knocked on the doorframe. "Principal Martinez? May I have a word?" Martinez looked up, clearly frazzled. "Miss Chen, this really isn't a good time. We're dealing with a disciplinary situation." "Yes, I know. That's why I'm here." Sarah stepped into the office and nodded respectfully to Elena's grandmother. "Mrs. Vasquez, I'm Sarah Chen, Elena's biology teacher." The older woman studied Sarah's face for a moment, then nodded back. "Usted es la maestra de quien habla Elena." "La soldado." Sarah's Spanish was rusty, but she caught the meaning. "Sí, señora. Soy maestra ahora." Elena looked up at Sarah with something like surprise. "You speak Spanish?" "Not well, but I picked up some during the evacuation of the Nueva Esperanza colony." "Your grandmother says you've mentioned me." "Principal Martinez," Sarah continued, turning to face the administrator, "I'd like to hear Elena's side of what happened." "Miss Chen, with respect, this doesn't concern you. We have witness statements from multiple students, all of whom were friends of Derek Morrison, I imagine." Sarah kept her voice level, but there was something in her tone that made Martinez pause. "Principal Martinez, may I ask if you've read Elena's file? Her complete file?" "Of course I have." "Then, you know that 3 years ago, Elena watched her parents die in a transport crash. She was trapped in the wreckage for 6 hours before rescue crews could extract her. She spent 2 months in the hospital, undergoing skin grafts and reconstructive surgery." Sarah's voice remained calm, clinical. "She's been diagnosed with PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorder. She's also working 20 hours a week to help support her grandmother, maintaining a 4.0 GPA, and tutoring 3 other students in advanced mathematics." Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Chen, Elena's personal circumstances don't excuse threatening another student. What exactly did she threaten him with?" Sarah interrupted. "According to the witnesses, she described in graphic detail what she would do to his anatomy if he continued to bother her." Sarah turned to Elena. "Is that what happened?" Elena's jaw was clenched so tightly Sarah could see the muscles jumping, but she managed to speak. "He threatened me first. He said I should ask around about what happened to other girls who didn't do what he wanted. He was talking about sexual assault, Ms. Chen. He was threatening to rape me." The office fell silent. Sarah could see Martinez processing this information, could see the exact moment when the administrator realized the situation was more complicated than she had assumed. "Did you report Derek's threat to Mr. Rodriguez?" Sarah asked. "Would it have mattered?" Elena's voice was bitter. "Derek Morrison is the golden boy. His daddy sits on the school board. I'm just the crazy girl with dead parents who works in a diner. Who do you think they're going to believe?" Sarah looked at Principal Martinez. "Did anyone bother to ask Elena what Derek said to provoke her response?" The witnesses said Derek was just asking about lab partners." The same witnesses who happened to be Derek's teammates and friends. Sarah sat down across from Martinez's desk. Principal Martinez, I've read Derek Morrison's file too. 3 complaints of inappropriate behavior toward female students in the past 2 years. 2 incidents of academic dishonesty that were quietly swept away. A pattern of using his status to intimidate and manipulate other students. Martinez looked genuinely surprised. How do you know about those files? Because I asked to see them. Because when I see a student like Elena being systematically targeted, I do my research. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Principal Martinez, I've commanded soldiers in combat. I know the difference between a predator and prey. And I know which one Derek Morrison is. Elena's grandmother had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding, despite the language barrier. Now she spoke up in careful English. My Elena, she is good girl. She work hard. She never hurt nobody who don't try to hurt her first. Mrs. Vasquez, Martinez said gently, I understand this is difficult, but Elena did use threatening language, so did Derek, Sarah interjected. The difference is that Elena's threat was a defensive response to a sexual predator, while Derek's was an attempt to coerce compliance through fear. You're making some very serious accusations, Ms. Chen. Am I? Then, let's investigate them properly. Let's bring in Derek and his friends and ask them to repeat their statements under oath. Let's pull the security camera footage from the hallway outside the chemistry lab. Let's do a proper investigation instead of just accepting the word of the popular kid and his entourage. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the politics of the situation. Sarah recognized the look. She had seen it on the faces of military commanders who knew what the right decision was but were afraid of the consequences. There are no cameras in that particular hallway, Martinez finally admitted. Convenient, Elena muttered. But, Martinez continued, you raise valid points about the need for a more thorough investigation. Elena, I'm going to suspend your suspension pending a full review of the incident. Ms. Chen, I'd appreciate it if you could provide a written statement regarding Elena's character and academic performance. Of course, Sarah said. But, I'd like to suggest something else as well. What's that? Let me talk to Derek Morrison. Martinez blinked. I'm not sure that's appropriate. You're not a counselor or Principal Martinez. I've negotiated ceasefires with alien species who communicate through pheromones and electromagnetic pulses. I think I can handle one teenage bully. Elena spoke up for the first time in several minutes. Ms. Chen, you don't understand what you're dealing with. Derek isn't just some random jerk. His father basically owns this town. The Morrisons have money, influence, connections. They can make your life hell. Sarah looked at Elena with something that might have been amusement. Elena, I've been declared an enemy of 3 different star systems, had bounties placed on my head by war criminals, and once spent 6 months being hunted by Krillian assassins. I think I can handle a small-town political dynasty. After Elena and her grandmother left, Sarah found herself alone with Principal Martinez. The administrator looked exhausted, older than her years, worn down by the endless balancing act of trying to educate children while navigating the political minefield of parental expectations, budget constraints, and bureaucratic mandates. You know, Martinez said quietly, when I took this job, I thought the hardest part would be the academics. Making sure kids learned what they needed to know to succeed in life. I never realized how much of education is just politics. It's the same everywhere, Sarah replied. Even in the fleet, half the battle was dealing with competing interests, conflicting priorities, people who cared more about their own advancement than the mission. But, you managed it. You held together an alliance of dozens of different species, each with their own agendas. How? Sarah considered the question. By remembering what we were fighting for. Not against the hegemony, but for the right of every sentient being to determine their own destiny. Every time I had to make a decision, I asked myself, will this choice protect that principle, or undermine it? And, Elena? What principle are you protecting here? The same one. Elena has the right to get an education without being sexually harassed by privileged boys who think their status makes them untouchable. She has the right to defend herself when threatened. And she has the right to be judged by her actions, not her circumstances. Martinez nodded slowly. You realize that if you push this, if you really investigate Derek Morrison's behavior, there will be consequences. His father won't just sit quietly and let his son's reputation be damaged. What kind of consequences? The kind that could end your teaching career before it really starts. Richard Morrison has a lot of influence with the school board. He could make sure you never teach in this district again. Maybe in this state. Sarah thought about that. She thought about the comfortable retirement she could have had, the consulting offers from major corporations, the book deals and speaking engagements that could have made her wealthy. She thought about the quiet life she had planned to build here, away from the complexities of galactic politics and interspecies diplomacy. Then, she thought about Elena, sitting in that chair with her grandmother's hand in hers, facing suspension for the crime of refusing to submit to a predator. Principal Martinez, Sarah said, let me tell you something about consequences. 3 years ago, I had to choose between following a direct order from Fleet Command and protecting a convoy of refugee ships. Following the order would have saved my career and possibly prevented a diplomatic incident. Disobeying it meant court-martial, disgrace, and the end of everything I had worked for. What did you choose? I chose the refugees. 8,000 civilians, mostly families with children, made it safely to neutral space because I was willing to face the consequences of doing what was right instead of what was politically expedient. Sarah stood up and moved toward the door. You want to know what the real consequence was? Those 8,000 people got to live. Their children got to grow up. They got to build new lives on new worlds, free from fear. Everything else was just politics. And this situation? What do you think the consequence of protecting Elena will be? Sarah paused at the door. If we do this right? Maybe one brilliant young woman will learn that the world isn't entirely filled with predators and cowards. Maybe she'll grow up to become the scientist she's meant to be. Maybe she'll discover something that changes the galaxy. And if we do it wrong? Then, we'll have taught her that might makes right, that status trumps justice, and that adults can't be trusted to protect the vulnerable. Sarah looked back at Martinez. Which consequence can you live with? After leaving the principal's office, Sarah went looking for Derek Morrison. She found him in the athletic department, holding court with his teammates in the weight room. The conversation died when she walked in. Derek, I need to speak with you privately. The boy looked around at his friends, clearly weighing his options. I don't have to talk to you. You're not the principal or a counselor or anything. You're right, Sarah agreed. You don't have to talk to me. But, I thought you might want the chance to tell your side of the story before I write my report about today's incident. That got his attention. What report? The one Principal Martinez asked me to prepare regarding the confrontation between you and Elena Vasquez. The one that will become part of your permanent record and potentially affect your college scholarship applications. Derek's swagger faltered slightly. Look, I don't know what that psycho told you, but she's lying. All I did was ask her to be my lab partner, and she went nuts. Started threatening to cut off my Derek, stop talking. Sarah's voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that came from years of commanding people in life or death situations. Just stop. Because right now, you're digging yourself into a hole that you might not be able to get out of. She walked over to a bench and sat down, gesturing for Derek to take the one across from her. After a moment's hesitation, he complied. Derek, can I ask you something? When you look at Elena, what do you see? I see a freak who thinks she's better than everyone else because she gets good grades. Really? Because when I look at Elena, I see a 16-year-old girl who watched her parents die, who works 20 hours a week to support her elderly grandmother, who maintains perfect grades despite dealing with PTSD and grief, and who has never hurt anyone who didn't threaten her first. Derek shifted uncomfortably. Look, I'm sorry her parents died or whatever, but that doesn't give her the right to threaten people. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. It doesn't. Just like your football scholarship and your father's position don't give you the right to threaten people either. I never threatened her. Derek, 3 witnesses heard you tell Elena to ask around about what happens to girls who don't cooperate with you. In what universe is that not a threat? The boy's face reddened. That's not what I meant. Then, what did you mean? Because from where I sit, it sounds like you were implying that you have a history of retaliating against girls who refuse to do what you want. Derek was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him processing the implications of what she was saying. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, less confident. You don't understand what it's like, he said. Everyone expects me to be perfect. Perfect grades, perfect games, perfect everything. If I mess up that chemistry practical, I could lose my scholarship. I could lose everything. So could Elena, Sarah replied. The difference is that she's trying to earn her future through hard work and intelligence, while you're trying to steal hers through intimidation and coercion. It's not like that. Isn't it? Derek, let me ask you something else. How many times have you used your status as quarterback, your father's influence, your social position to get what you want from other students? Derek's silence was answer enough. How many times have you been given second chances, had your mistakes overlooked, been allowed to slide by on charm and connections instead of actual merit? Everyone does it, Derek muttered. It's just how things work. Not everyone, Derek. Elena doesn't. She earns everything she gets, and she does it without stepping on anyone else. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Derek, I'm going to tell you something that might save your life someday. The world is bigger than Jefferson High School. It's bigger than this town, this state, this planet. And, out there in the real world, being the star quarterback of a small-town high school football team doesn't mean anything. My dad says your dad is wrong. Sarah's voice was gentle but implacable. Derek, I've traveled across the galaxy. I've met beings so advanced they could power a city with their thoughts, and others so primitive they communicate by changing colors. And, you know what I've learned? The only thing that matters, anywhere in the universe, is what you contribute. What you create. What you give back. Derek looked up at her, and, for a moment Sarah saw past the arrogant teenager to the scared boy underneath. What am I supposed to do? If I fail chemistry, if I lose my scholarship? Then, you'll find another way, Sarah said simply. You'll work harder, study more, find your own path instead of coasting on other people's efforts. And, maybe, just maybe, you'll discover that earning something yourself feels better than having it handed to you. She stood up, preparing to leave. Derek, I'm going to give you a choice. You can continue down the path you're on, using threats and intimidation to get what you want from people like Elena. Eventually, that path leads to a very dark place. Trust me on that. Or you can start over. Apologize to Elena. Find a legitimate lab partner. Actually study for your chemistry practical. And, if I choose the second option? Then, maybe you'll discover that there's more to life than being the biggest fish in a very small pond. Sarah was almost to the door when Derek called after her. Miss Chen? Elena really is brilliant, isn't she? Sarah turned back. Brilliant doesn't even begin to cover it, Derek. That girl has the kind of mind that comes along maybe once in a generation. She could discover new forms of life, develop cures for diseases, solve problems we haven't even imagined yet. But, only if people like you stop trying to tear her down. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm hoping you're smart enough to recognize that being the person who helped someone like Elena succeed is infinitely more valuable than being the person who destroyed her. That evening, Sarah sat in her empty classroom grading papers and thinking about the conversation with Derek. She wasn't naive enough to think that one talk would completely change the boy's worldview, but she had seen something in his eyes at the end, a flicker of understanding that gave her hope. Her communicator buzzed with another message from Marcus, heard through the grapevine that you're already stirring up trouble. Morrison Sr. is apparently asking questions about your background. You sure you want to poke that particular bear? Sarah typed back, Marcus, remember the siege of Kepler Station? When we were outnumbered 50-1 and Admiral Crawford wanted us to retreat? The response came quickly. You said that sometimes the only way to win is to make sure the other side knows you're not afraid to lose everything. Exactly. Sarah put away her communicator and returned to her papers. She had a lesson planned to finish for tomorrow's class on predator-prey relationships. It seemed particularly relevant. Outside, the football team was finishing their evening practice. Through her window, Sarah could see Derek Morrison running drills with his teammates, but every few minutes his gaze drifted toward the science building where Elena would be arriving soon for her evening shift at the diner. Sarah made a mental note to have another conversation with the boy. Some lessons took time to sink in, and she had learned during the war that the most important victories were often the ones that happened not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when people chose to be better than they had been before. Her door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see Elena standing in the doorway, backpack over her shoulder and dressed in the black pants and white shirt of her diner uniform. "Miss Chen? I wanted to thank you for today." "You don't need to thank me, Elena. I just did what anyone should do when they see an injustice." Elena stepped into the classroom and closed the door behind her. "That's not true, and we both know it. Most teachers would have stayed out of it. Would have let the administration handle it quietly, let me take the suspension and move on. Most teachers haven't seen what happens when good people stay silent while bullies run free," Sarah replied. Elena sat down in the front row, her usual spot in the back corner abandoned for once. "Miss Chen, can I ask you something? About the war?" "Of course. When you were fighting the hegemony, were you ever afraid that you were becoming like them? That all the violence and death was changing you into something you didn't recognize?" Sarah set down her pen and looked at Elena carefully. It was a more sophisticated question than most adults would ask, and it cut right to the heart of something Sarah had struggled with throughout the war. "Every day," she admitted. "Every time I gave an order that would result in deaths, every time I had to choose between saving some lives and sacrificing others, I wondered if I was losing pieces of myself that I would never get back." "How did you deal with it?" "By remembering why I was fighting. Not for conquest or revenge, but to protect the right of every sentient being to live free from fear. And by surrounding myself with people who would call me out if they saw me crossing lines I shouldn't cross." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes I feel like the anger is going to consume me. Like it's already consumed me, and there's nothing left of who I used to be before my parents died." "Elena, can I tell you about the first time I killed someone?" The girl's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "I was 23, fresh out of officer training. We were boarding a hegemony supply ship that intelligence said was carrying medical supplies to refugee camps. But when we breached the hull, we found children. Dozens of them, from 6 different species, being transported to forced labor camps." Sarah's voice was steady, clinical, but Elena could hear the pain underneath. The hegemony officer in charge drew his weapon when he saw us. He was pointing it at a little Andromedan girl, couldn't have been more than 7 years old by their standards. And I knew that if I hesitated, if I tried to negotiate or find a peaceful solution, that child would die. "So you shot him?" "I shot him. And, in that moment, I felt something inside me break. Because taking a life, even to save others, changes you fundamentally. It has to, if you're going to remain human." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "But you kept fighting." "I kept fighting. Because the alternative was to let monsters like him continue hurting children. Because sometimes the only way to protect innocence is to sacrifice your own." Sarah looked directly at Elena. "But here's the thing I learned, Elena. The anger you feel, the rage at injustice and cruelty and senseless loss? That's not something to be afraid of. That's your conscience speaking. That's your heart refusing to accept that this is just how the world has to be. But what if it turns me into someone I don't want to be? Then, you use it as fuel instead of letting it consume you. You channel it into determination to make things better, to prevent others from experiencing what you've experienced. You let it drive you to excellence, to achievement, to becoming the person who can actually change things." Elena smiled, and, for the first time since Sarah had known her, it was a smile without bitterness or defensive armor. "Miss Chen? When I first heard you were going to be our teacher, I looked up everything I could find about you. The battles you fought, the lives you saved, the way you brought together all those different species to fight against tyranny. Elena, I want to be like you, Elena said quietly. Not the war hero part, but the part that refuses to give up. The part that sees something wrong and does something about it, consequences be damned. Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen. Elena, you already are like that. You've been fighting your whole life, just on a different kind of battlefield. And you've never stopped believing that knowledge and truth matter more than popularity or power. Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough. It's more than enough. It's everything. Sarah gathered her papers and stood up. Elena, I need you to promise me something. What? Never let anyone convince you that your anger is inappropriate. Never let anyone tell you to smile and accept injustice quietly. And never, ever let anyone make you feel like you have to apologize for being smarter, stronger, or more determined than they are. Elena stood up as well, shouldering her backpack. I promise. But only if you promise me something too. What's that? Promise me that you'll stay. That when things get difficult, when people like Derek's father start making trouble for you, you won't just transfer to some other school or go back to your old life. Sarah looked at Elena's serious young face and saw something of herself at that age, full of idealism and determination and the unshakable belief that the universe could be made better through effort and will. I promise, Sarah said. But, Elena? I'm not the only one who needs to stay. This place needs you too. Not just for the next 2 years until you graduate, but afterward. It needs people like you to come back and teach, to run for office, to start businesses and nonprofits and all the other ways you can make a difference in people's lives. Elena paused at the door. You really think I could come back? After everything that's happened here? I think, Sarah said, that there's no limit to what you can accomplish if you decide that's what you want to do. And I think this town would be very lucky to have you. After Elena left for her shift at the diner, Sarah finished her lesson planning and drove home through the quiet streets of Jefferson. It was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where change came slowly and tradition carried more weight than innovation. But it was also the kind of place where one person could make a real difference, where the impact of good teaching or ethical leadership could ripple outward for generations. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah's communicator chimed one more time. This message wasn't from Marcus, though. It was from Principal Martinez, board meeting tomorrow at 7 p.m. Richard Morrison has requested a full review of today's incident and your involvement in it. Thought you should know. Sarah deleted the message and went inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had lesson plans to review and papers to grade. The ordinary work of education, which was perhaps the most important work in the universe. She thought about Elena, starting another long shift at the diner, serving coffee and clearing tables while her mind worked through complex scientific principles. She thought about Derek Morrison, hopefully lying awake wondering if there might be a better way to live than the one his father had taught him. And she thought about the 37 other students in her classes, each carrying their own dreams and fears and potential, waiting to see what kind of world the adults around them were going to create for them to inherit. It was, Sarah reflected, a responsibility that made commanding a starship seem simple by comparison. But it was also the most hopeful thing she had ever done. The Jefferson High School board meeting was held in the same gymnasium where Derek Morrison had scored the winning touchdown that secured the district championship 3 years running. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as she walked past banners celebrating athletic achievements while preparing to defend academic integrity. Richard Morrison sat in the front row like a general surveying a battlefield he was confident of winning. He was a large man with silver hair and the kind of bearing that came from decades of having his opinions matter more than facts. Beside him sat 2 other board members Sarah recognized from newspaper photos, Margaret Henley, who owned the largest real estate firm in town, and Dr. James Patterson, whose wife had taken the sabbatical that created Sarah's teaching position in the first place. Principal Martinez looked like she hadn't slept in days. She kept glancing between Sarah and the Morrison faction with the expression of someone watching 2 storm fronts converge. This special session of the Jefferson High School Board of Education is now called to order, announced Board President Susan Walsh, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses who had been teaching in the district for 40 years before moving into administration. We're here to review the incident involving student Derek Morrison and Elena Vasquez, and the subsequent intervention by faculty member Sarah Chen. Richard Morrison was on his feet before Walsh had finished speaking. Madam President, I want to begin by expressing my family's shock and dismay at the treatment my son has received at this institution. Derek has been a model student and athlete throughout his academic career. He's maintained adequate grades while carrying the responsibility of leading our football team to 3 consecutive championships. And now, because of the biased intervention of a teacher with a documented history of violence, his academic standing and college prospects are being threatened. Sarah felt a familiar calm descend over her, the same focused clarity she had experienced before every major engagement during the war. She had faced down alien war criminals and genocidal fanatics. Richard Morrison, for all his bluster, was just another bully with an inflated sense of his own importance. Mr. Morrison, Walsh replied, Ms. Chen will have an opportunity to present her perspective. But, first, let's hear from Principal Martinez about the incident itself. Martinez stood up, consulting her notes. On Friday afternoon, there was an altercation between Derek Morrison and Elena Vasquez in Mr. Rodriguez's chemistry classroom. Multiple witnesses reported that Elena made threatening statements toward Derek after he approached her about partnering for a lab practical. Threatening statements? Richard Morrison interrupted. She described in graphic detail how she planned to mutilate my son's genitals. And this was witnessed by multiple students who are now afraid to attend chemistry class because of Elena Vasquez's violent outburst. Board member Henley leaned forward. Principal Martinez, what exactly did Miss Vasquez say? Martinez looked deeply uncomfortable. According to the witness statements, Elena described various anatomical vulnerabilities and how they might be exploited. The language was scientifically precise but emotionally disturbing. In other words, Morrison continued, she threatened to castrate my son. And then, Ms. Chen, instead of supporting appropriate disciplinary action, chose to intervene on behalf of this clearly unstable girl. Sarah had remained silent during this exchange, but now she stood up. May I respond to those accusations, Madam President? Walsh nodded. Ms. Chen, you have the floor. Thank you. Sarah walked to the center of the room, positioning herself where she could address both the board and the audience that had gathered for the meeting. She noticed Elena sitting in the back row with her grandmother, both of them looking small and vulnerable in the hostile atmosphere. Members of the board, I'd like to begin by addressing Mr. Morrison's characterization of my background. Yes, I served in the Galactic conflict. Yes, I was involved in military actions that resulted in casualties. But I'd like to read you something. Sarah pulled out her tablet and accessed a file she had prepared. This is from the official fleet report on the evacuation of Nueva Esperanza colony, where over 2,000 human civilians were trapped during a hegemony assault. Quote, Commander Chen's tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment to protecting non-combatants resulted in the successful evacuation of all civilian personnel with 0 casualties. Her refusal to abandon vulnerable populations, even at significant risk to her own forces, exemplifies the highest ideals of the Galactic Fleet. She looked directly at Richard Morrison. Mr. Morrison, my documented history of violence consists of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. And that's exactly what I was doing last Friday. You're twisting the facts. Morrison shot back. Your job is to teach biology, not to coddle troubled students who threaten other children. My job, Sarah replied calmly, is to educate all of my students and to create an environment where learning can take place. That includes protecting students from harassment and intimidation. Board member Dr. Patterson spoke up. Ms. Chen, can you explain your version of what happened in the chemistry classroom? I can, but I think it would be more helpful if the board heard the full story, not just the version being presented by Derek Morrison's friends. Sarah activated her tablet's holographic display, projecting her notes where everyone could see them. Mr. Morrison, you've mentioned multiple witnesses to Elena's threatening language. Can you name them? Morrison's confidence flickered slightly. Well, there's Tyler Jenkins, Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb is Derek's co-captain on the football team, Sarah interrupted. Tyler Jenkins is Derek's best friend since childhood, and his father works for your construction company. Would you like me to continue down the list of impartial witnesses? Their relationship to my son doesn't invalidate their testimony. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. Just as Elena's academic excellence and tragic personal history don't validate hers. Which is why I think we need to look at this situation more objectively. She manipulated her tablet display, bringing up a series of documents. Board members, I prepared a comprehensive analysis of this incident, including historical context you may not be aware of. What kind of historical context? Walsh asked. The pattern of behavior that led to Friday's confrontation. Sarah's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. Derek Morrison has been reported for inappropriate conduct toward female students 6 times in the past 2 years. 3 of those reports involved academic coercion, threatening poor grades or social ostracism unless girls completed his assignments for him. 2 involved unwanted physical contact. 1 involved explicit sexual harassment. The room erupted in angry voices. Richard Morrison was on his feet, his face red with fury. This is outrageous. You can't just make unfounded accusations. These aren't unfounded accusations, Mr. Morrison. These are official reports filed with the administration. Sarah turned to Principal Martinez. Principal Martinez, would you care to confirm the existence of these reports? Martinez looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Ms. Chen, those reports are confidential student records, which can be released with board approval for disciplinary proceedings, Sarah replied. I'm formally requesting that this board review Derek Morrison's complete disciplinary file as part of this investigation. Absolutely not. Morrison thundered. This is nothing but a witch hunt designed to destroy my son's reputation. Board President Walsh called for order. Mr. Morrison, please sit down. Ms. Chen, you're making very serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support them? I do. Sarah brought up another document on her display. This is a statement from Jennifer Walsh, your daughter, Madam President, describing an incident from last semester where Derek Morrison cornered her in the library and demanded she write his English essay for him. Susan Walsh's face went pale. Jennifer never told me about any incident with Derek Morrison. According to her statement, she was afraid to report it because Derek told her his father's influence could affect her college recommendation letters. Sound familiar? Sarah turned back to the full board. Members of the board, the incident on Friday wasn't an isolated event. It was the culmination of a pattern of predatory behavior that has been allowed to continue because Derek Morrison's athletic ability and family connections have made him essentially untouchable. This is ridiculous. Richard Morrison stood up again. My son is being attacked by a disturbed girl with a history of violence, and, instead of protecting him, this institution is participating in character assassination. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said quietly, what history of violence? Elena Vasquez has never been in a physical altercation. She's never been arrested, never been suspended for fighting, never harmed another student. Her only crime has been refusing to submit to your son's demands. She turned to address the room more broadly. Elena Vasquez is a 16-year-old girl who lost her parents in a traumatic accident, who works 20 hours a week to support her elderly grandmother, who maintains a 4.0 GPA while dealing with PTSD and depression. She's tutored struggling students for free, volunteered at the local science museum, and dreams of becoming a xenobiologist so she can help build bridges between different species. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Derek Morrison is an 18-year-old young man who has been given every advantage in life, who has used those advantages to intimidate and exploit his classmates, and who responded to Elena's refusal to do his homework by threatening her with sexual assault. She threatened to castrate him. Morrison shouted. She defended herself with words instead of violence, Sarah shot back. And, apparently, that terrifies you more than your son's actual threats of physical harm. The room fell silent. Sarah could see board members exchanging glances, could feel the momentum of the meeting shifting. But, she also knew that Richard Morrison wouldn't go down without a fight. Miss Chen, Dr. Patterson said carefully, even if we accept your characterization of Derek's behavior, don't you think Elena's response was excessive? Sarah turned to look at Elena, sitting in the back row. The girl met her eyes and nodded slightly, giving permission for what Sarah was about to do. Dr. Patterson, let me tell you what Elena actually said to Derek Morrison. Sarah consulted her notes. She said, and I quote, "If you ever threaten me or any other girl in this school again, I will ensure that your ability to reproduce becomes a matter of purely academic interest." She then proceeded to describe, in medically accurate terms, the anatomical vulnerabilities of the human male reproductive system. Sarah paused, looking around the room. Elena Vasquez is planning to study medicine. She was using scientific terminology to describe biological functions. Yes, the implication was threatening, but it was also precise, articulate, and completely defensive in nature. Board member Henley spoke up. Ms. Chen, regardless of the medical accuracy, threatening another student is against school policy. You're absolutely right, Sarah interrupted. Which is why Derek Morrison should face disciplinary action for threatening Elena with sexual assault. Or do school policies only apply to students who don't have influential parents? Richard Morrison was back on his feet. I've heard enough of this. Ms. Chen, you're clearly biased in favor of this girl, and you're using your celebrity status to intimidate this board into accepting your version of events. Well, let me remind you that this isn't some alien battlefield where you can impose your will through force. This is a civilized community with rules and procedures. Sarah looked at Morrison for a long moment, and something in her expression made him take a step back. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost conversational. Mr. Morrison, you're right about one thing. This isn't a battlefield. But, you know what? You've been treating it like one. You've been using your son as a weapon to attack students you consider acceptable casualties. You've turned this school into a war zone where might makes right and the strong prey on the weak. She walked closer to him, and, despite being half his size, somehow seemed to loom over him. The difference between us, Mr. Morrison, is that I fought to protect the innocent. You fight to protect your own privilege. I sacrificed my own comfort to serve something greater than myself. You sacrifice other people's children to maintain your son's advantage. Sarah turned back to the board. Members of the board, I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to investigate. Pull Derek Morrison's disciplinary files. Interview the girls he's harassed. Talk to the teachers who have witnessed his behavior. Look at the pattern of complaints that have been quietly buried because of his family's influence. And, if you're not willing to do that, Sarah continued, then, I'll do it myself. I'll compile every report, interview every victim, document every cover-up. And, then, I'll present it to the district superintendent, the state education board, and the local media. The threat hung in the air like a live grenade. Richard Morrison's face was purple with rage, but Sarah could see fear in his eyes now. Board President Walsh called for a 15-minute recess. As board members filed out to discuss the situation privately, Sarah found herself surrounded by community members who had attended the meeting. Elena's grandmother approached first, taking Sarah's hands in her weathered ones. Gracias, maestra. Gracias por defender a mi nieta. De nada, señora. Elena is a remarkable young woman. She deserves better than this. Other parents approached, some offering support, others clearly hostile. Sarah listened politely to all of them, but her attention was focused on Elena, who was sitting alone while the adults argued about her future. Sarah walked over and sat down beside her. How are you holding up? Elena shrugged. About how you'd expect. Half the town thinks I'm a psychotic threat to their children, the other half thinks I'm a victim who can't defend herself. Nobody wants to consider that maybe I'm just a person who refuses to be pushed around. For what it's worth, I think you're handling this with remarkable maturity. Miss Chen, can I ask you something? Do you really think this will make a difference? Even if the board sides with us, even if Derek gets disciplined, do you think anything will actually change? Sarah considered the question. Elena, I've learned that change is almost always incremental. You don't transform a system overnight. You change it one decision at a time, one person at a time, one stand against injustice at a time. But what if it's not enough? What if Derek's father finds a way to get you fired? What if I end up expelled and blacklisted from every college in the state? Then, we'll find another way. Elena, the universe is vast and full of opportunities. You're brilliant, determined, and principled. Those qualities will take you anywhere you want to go, regardless of what happens in this small town. Elena managed a small smile. Promise me something, Miss Chen? What's that? Promise me that if they come after you because of this, you won't blame yourself. You didn't start this fight. You just refused to let it continue unchallenged. Before Sarah could respond, Board President Walsh called the meeting back to order. The board members looked grim as they took their seats, and Sarah could sense that the next few minutes would determine not just Elena's future, but the kind of institution Jefferson High would become. After deliberation, Walsh announced, the board has voted to table this matter pending a full investigation into the allegations raised tonight. We will be reviewing all relevant disciplinary records, conducting interviews with students and faculty, and consulting with the district's legal counsel about appropriate procedures. Richard Morrison shot to his feet. This is unacceptable. You're allowing a biased teacher to railroad my son based on unsubstantiated accusations from a disturbed girl. Mr. Morrison, Walsh replied firmly, the board has made its decision. The investigation will be conducted by an independent third party to ensure fairness to all involved. And, in the meantime? What happens to my son's education? His college prospects? Derek will continue attending classes as normal, as will Elena Vasquez. Both students will be monitored to ensure there are no further incidents. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had won this round, but the war was far from over. Richard Morrison's expression made it clear that he considered this a temporary setback, not a defeat. As the meeting broke up, Sarah noticed Derek Morrison himself for the first time. He had been sitting in a corner throughout the proceedings, looking smaller and younger than his usual swagger would suggest. While his father held court with supporters, Derek approached Sarah hesitantly. Miss Chen? Can I talk to you for a minute? Sarah was surprised, but she nodded. Of course. They walked to a quiet corner of the gymnasium. Derek looked around nervously, making sure his father couldn't hear them. Miss Chen, I want you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. I never wanted Elena to get in trouble or for my dad to start this whole thing. Derek, what exactly did you mean when you told Elena to ask around about what happens to girls who don't cooperate with you? The boy's face crumpled slightly. I don't know. I was frustrated and angry, and I said something stupid. But I never would have actually hurt her or anyone else. Derek, intention matters, but so does impact. Elena has been sexually harassed before. When you make comments like that, you're not just being stupid, you're participating in a pattern of intimidation that makes school unsafe for girls like her. Derek was quiet for a long moment. Miss Chen, what you said in the weight room about the world being bigger than Jefferson High, did you mean that? Every word. Because sometimes I feel like I'm trapped in this role, you know? Like everyone expects me to be this perfect athlete and popular kid, and if I'm not, then I'm nothing. Like my whole identity is just football and being Richard Morrison's son. Sarah saw something in Derek's expression that reminded her of Elena, a young person struggling to figure out who they were beyond the labels others had placed on them. Derek, you're 18 years old. You have your entire life ahead of you. You can choose to be anyone you want to be. But that choice starts with taking responsibility for who you've been. What do you mean? I mean apologizing to Elena. Not because your father or the board tells you to, but because it's the right thing to do. I mean acknowledging that you've used your status to hurt people, and committing to doing better. Derek looked across the gymnasium to where Elena was helping her grandmother with her coat. Do you think she'd even listen to an apology from me? I think Elena is one of the most forgiving people I've ever met, as long as she believes the apology is genuine. And how do I prove that? By changing your behavior. By standing up for people instead of tearing them down. By using your influence to make school better for everyone, not just yourself. Derek nodded slowly. Miss Chen? If I do try to change, to be better, will you help me? I mean, I know I don't deserve it, but I don't really know how to be anyone other than who I've always been. Sarah felt something shift in her perspective on Derek Morrison. He wasn't just a privileged bully, he was a confused teenager who had been taught terrible lessons about power and entitlement by adults who should have known better. Derek, if you're serious about changing, then, yes, I'll help you. But, you need to understand that this isn't going to be easy. Real change requires admitting that you've been wrong, making amends to people you've hurt, and doing the hard work of becoming someone better. I understand. As Derek walked away to rejoin his father, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic. She had seen similar moments during the war: enemy soldiers who realized they were fighting for the wrong side, officers who chose to defect rather than participate in atrocities. Change was always possible, but it required courage and humility in equal measure. Elena appeared at Sarah's side. Was Derek Morrison actually apologizing to you? Something like that. Elena, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that Derek might approach you directly to apologize. Elena's expression hardened. And, I'm supposed to just forgive him? Pretend like the past 2 years of harassment never happened? No, Sarah said firmly. You're not supposed to do anything. If Derek apologizes, you can accept it or reject it based on whether you believe it's sincere. You don't owe forgiveness to anyone, Elena. But, I want you to be open to the possibility that people can change. Even bullies? Especially bullies. Some of the best people I've ever known were once the worst. The war taught me that redemption is always possible, but it has to be earned. As they walked toward the exit, Sarah noticed Richard Morrison watching them with undisguised hostility. She,